Dozenko's Earth has a consistent style focusing on characters' faces, with special attention paid to exaggerated displays of emotion. Even absent dialogue cards in certain shots, the characters' faces tell a story that the audience can understand and place their own words into. Characters are typically center frame in mid-shots. The most dramatic of these is of the character Aponis, who serves as a sort of impediment to the original semi-protagonist of the film, only to step into light as the new protagonist. This is the first center frame image of Aponis' face in the film. His emotions are conveyed through his eyes, tear-stained and full of resolve. This is an important moment for the character, who before has been confined to keeping his back turned to the audience, and his back as well symbolically turned to communism. Now he has the resolve from his Basil's death to embrace it, and embrace the audience. He steps in as the protagonist of the rest of the film. Aponis here is lit from the front, and like other mid-shots of characters, he is in focus, whereas the background is not. No other character is visible at this moment. All attention belongs to Aponis. His face soon erupts in rage, leading to the next shot. When pursued by Aponis, the shot is not at eye level, but instead slightly above, as though to avoid portraying him as a bully. Who is he pursuing? Is he pursuing the audience? We step back in an almost practical retreat. Finally, he confronts Thomas, who we later find is in fact the murderer of Basil. Here, the perspective is suddenly vice versa. Suddenly, the audience is behind Aponis, questioning Thomas with him, as though we were one of his comrades who did not walk from behind. We examine Thomas's face for any sign of guilt, or any sign to even believe him. Aponis leans forward. One can tell that Aponis does not believe him. Although it may be a stretch to say, this sequence as a whole is united primarily by both plot and the form of the music. This is the metamorphosis of Aponis. Every occurrence here is a catalyst to the reaction of his embrace. Aponis shifts from periods of still sorrow to standing above others, being the only individual moving actively in a shot. The only other person whose face conveys as much horror at the death of Basil is Basil's fiancée. Aponis manages to hold a grip on his emotions for some time, and this is typical of the style of film, with women having wailing, hysterical fits, and so too, in fact, Thomas does later on in the film. Mid-shots of mourners' faces and torsos here are typical. The aspect ratio is very square, and the angle of the shots is usually from eye perspective. Repeating a motif in the death of the grandfather, a child is seen here eating fruit. The child does not seem to understand what is actually occurring. Here, the music builds upon it, as long as Aponis' rage. In a twist on the Kuleshov effect, Aponis shouts in the house, but soon is seen shouting on top of a mountain. He seems to be shouting at the sky itself. We stand under Aponis. An empty shot of nature is typical of the film, usually linking scenes with each other. An alternate perspective now, given the almost bombastic nature of Aponis, is that his steps do not cause us to quake as we retreat. but in fact are the steps of a giant. The camera shakes with this. In the background, a man seems to flee. This shot, coupled with the rest of the sequence, is all the more dramatic. It can be truly appreciated as a metamorphosis of Aponis, who before was non-confrontational and typically quiet. Lights fade in and out as to what seems to be the passage of time. Aponis here is portrayed as being immobile once more for nearly 2 days, with the light fading in and out as though the sun was rising and falling. Is Aponis mourning, or is he deep in thought? The shadows cast on his face prevent us from getting an accurate display of his emotions. What is he waiting for? Unknown at first by the audience, a knock occurs on the door. Aponis reacts to this with paranoia and suspicion. Once more it is up to Aponis to be the active role. The women in the shot are continuously still. Aponis must rise to the challenge. The lighting from behind almost seems to make the door glow, as though it was an ominous and dangerous being. The door quakes with heavy knocking. We now know that it was a knock on the door. Who's behind the door? The tension is built from this continuous long shot. We see Aponis' face as though we were standing before him. Instead, it is the priest. Aponis and the priest stare down each other, immobile once more. The camera zooms in closer on Aponis' face, giving one of the few extreme close-ups of the film. Contrawise to Aponis, the priest seems to almost be dead, lack of emotion. Aponis' metamorphosis here is complete. He is no longer willing to regard the priest, instead looking away, as he had looked away from others early in the film. The priest turns away like a scolded child. Aponis suddenly finds himself back in the house without any fading or linkage between the shots. Once more he is still, but he is rised above the others, standing tall. His eyes are the only eyes we can see amongst the characters initially. We are reminded of the tractor scene by this shot. People sit and wait, and it takes one man to come up with a plan. Finally, Aponis speaks. Is he speaking to us, or are we standing behind him once more? Aponis' words rouse the crowd. An almost longing sort of happiness appears on his face. His image of the glorious funeral for Basil. Although the other characters look towards Aponis, Aponis is the only one who regards us directly. The lighting on Aponis makes him seem to glow compared to the other characters in the room, lighting from both the front and the top.